Hey Shogi fans. I said in my last Tsume video that there was much more that could be said about Tsume, and I hope now that I'm making another video on it, you realize I was right. Tsumeshogi, or checkmate puzzles, are widely considered one of the best ways of training a shogi skill. Tsume allows you to train your reading, your endgame awareness, and your pattern recognition without needing a training partner, which makes it ideal for downtime training. That said, in the many years I've been playing, promoting, and teaching shogi, I've seen a lot of people, including myself sometimes, approach Tsumeshogi in a way that is, in my opinion, not as effective as it could be. Picture your last training session. Maybe you were on your phone using a Tsume app, or maybe on a leash shogi puzzle, or reading a book. You see the problem, you find a solution that you're pretty sure is right, and you check it. Great! You got the right solution, so you move on to the next problem. But when you do that, you're leaving a lot of potential learning on the table. It's kind of like having chicken wings for dinner and leaving a bunch of meat still on the bone. There is room in your training regimen for doing this kind of blitz style practice, but reflecting on the depth of puzzles can really supercharge your pattern recognition. While sometimes the story of a Tsume really is as simple as, wow, cool, gold on the head is really strong, sometimes even pretty simple problems can have a lot more depth than you expect at first glance. Let's take this classic 3-move Tsume for example. I'm sure you've seen it before if you've been playing shogi for long enough. You know that taking the silver doesn't work because a loosely supported silver on the head is too weak to checkmate by itself. So you know that you sacrifice the horse first, and whichever silver takes, you drop a silver on the ear, and the problem is solved. Great! On to the next problem. But wait, you have an opportunity to reflect on this problem. Think of it as doing post-game analysis on your Tsume. What are the properties that make this problem work? The key to this problem is the silver's blind spot. On both attack and defense, the silver being unable to capture to the side is a hindrance. Knowing this, there are two key facts you can take from this problem. 1. A king being defended by silvers is weak to one of the silvers being pulled out of position. And 2. Trying to find a way to drop a silver on the king's ear can overcome the silver's attacking weakness. Let's put what we've learned here into practice with a couple more puzzles. First off, we've got this common scenario where Static Rook has broken through and destroyed a Mino castle, and all that's left is to checkmate the king. Remember what we learned last time. A loosely supported silver on the head is weak. So if you try silver 7-2, the king can just get away to the side, and even making a discovered check, the king will still be able to escape. Therefore, if you play silver to the ear, that covers that spot that the silver wouldn't have been able to defend, and the king is bound against the dragon with nowhere to go. This is checkmate. Do you remember that we learned 2 lessons from the first problem? Let's apply the other one to this problem. The silver next to the king is defending the king's head, but one of the things we learned in the first puzzle is that a defensive silver can be forced out of position to expose a weakness. So first, we again drop a silver on the king's ear. There's no legal move but to take it, and then silver on the head is checkmate. By the way, we're not done here, because there's actually another lesson we can learn from this problem. You can accommodate for your silver's blind spot by forcing one of your opponent's pieces into the blind spot. Now, let's look at a more complicated problem with a bit more to chew on. If you want to solve this problem before we go on, feel free to pause the video. I think the first thing most people might look at is gold drop 3-8, king runs to 1-9, and then dragon checks, which is a solid idea, drive the king into the corner and smother him, but the problem is the knight protects here, so that's not quite going to work. Maybe we could instead start by checking with the horse, but actually the knight's defending here, so now we see that our problem piece is the knight. This is going to be the biggest hang-up we have. But if you think about what we've learned before, we can use this knight to our advantage. You can accommodate for your silver's blind spot by forcing one of your opponent's pieces into it. So in this case, we can actually move the dragon into the line of fire. If the king takes it, then it's a gold on the head. This is a sideline, but we can actually learn a lesson from this too. we can see that the square gap horse exerts enough pressure that it's almost as if the king is pressed against the side of the board. So knowing that, the knight will take, and now we have to stop the king from getting away up the board. So we're going to sacrifice the horse in the silver's blind spot. The king has to take, and checkmate on 1-8. So now, looking back at the whole puzzle, we can see that the theme of the puzzle is using the major pieces to fill in the gaps left by your silver's defense before delivering the final blow on the edge of the board. If you approach a puzzle by analyzing the overall themes, rather than just finding the correct solution, you'll be able to more broadly apply it to your real games. Now, let's look at one final problem. This one's quite a bit harder, so feel free to try to solve it. This problem doesn't build on the previous ones like the rest in the video, but it has an interesting story to it that I would really like to go over. If you're very experienced in solving tsume, you may immediately be suspicious when you see the pawn in hand, but we'll get to that later. The two key things you'll likely notice here are that the bishop is behind the rook and that there's a token on 1-2. This is a pretty clear indication that not only is there going to be a discovered check by moving the rook, but also that the token is going to play a part in the final checkmate. So you might look at taking the pawn on 2-2 with the intention to corral the king up the board and deliver checkmate with the token. But if you do that, the king can actually drop a pawn on 2-7. If you haven't read through all the variations, you might not have even noticed that there's a lot of care put into the composition of this problem. So first, let's look at some variations. If the king instead drops a gold to block, you can just take it with the bishop. If he runs, then a simple gold on the belly. And if he runs here, gold on the head. And the same thing happens if he drops a silver, you just take it. If he runs, it's mate. And if he runs here, it's silver on the head. Of course, same thing with the rook, right? And even if he drops a knight to defend, you can just take it. If he runs, then it's pawn drop and token mates. And if he runs up, well, now you see why it's a bishop defending on 2-8 and not any other piece, because the knight drop is going to deliver mate. The other thing that the bishop being here does is it prevents the king from being able to drop a bishop on 2-7, which is important for your solution because you actually wouldn't be able to mate in this position with a bishop. But finally, there's one more thing. That pawn drop that I mentioned. If you take it, king runs, then it's fine. You just checkmate with a token. But if you run here, oh no. In shogi, you're not allowed to checkmate with a dropped pawn. So now we know why this pawn is here. So knowing the reason for this pawn, and knowing everything else we know about this puzzle, we know that we should leave that pawn there. Therefore, rook promotes to 2-3, right? Well, if you promote to 2-3, he can't drop the pawn here because you can't drop two pawns on a file. So dropping anything else, it's fine, right? But what if the king runs? Uh-oh. Mate with a dropped pawn again. This is that moment where if you've done a lot of Tsumeshogi, you already know what the problem here is, right? You don't promote the rook. King runs, pawn drop, and now, finally, you can checkmate with the token. And, by the way, if you're wondering what this pawn is doing here, it's stopping a line after the rook promotion where this is checkmate. Because this drop isn't feudal, it turns it into a 7-move problem. So it makes this, even though it's going to be a checkmate, It's not a solution. So what's the story in this problem? This sequence feels completely unrealistic, like solving this problem won't help in your games at all. How often are you actually going to be declining promotion in front of a pawn in order to avoid mate with a dropped pawn, right? Well, I think the pawn drop wasn't as important as the rest of the puzzle. The theme of this Tsume is finding all the mates with what the king has available to him. Tsume trains you to be ready for any piece to block, but notably in this problem, you don't even have to consider the bishop, and looking at what happens after blocking with a pawn is the key to finding the solution. Sometimes, denying specific pieces to your opponent is the key to winning a game, and puzzles like this reinforce that idea. Like I said at the end of my last video, there is still so much to say on the topic of checkmate puzzles, and I think even if I put out a video every week for a year, I wouldn't even come close to scratching the surface of everything that goes into it. But I hope that if you take a step back and analyze puzzles the same way you analyze your games, you'll see much more progress in your solo training. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to leave them in the comments, and make sure to like and subscribe for more Shogi videos. I'm Rico with Shogi House, and I'll see you next time.